Hello there, and welcome back to this episode of Ignition Time. I hope everyone's doing well. I hope everyone's having a wonderful day as Congress gears up this week to pass the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, the whopping American Rescue Plan. There was a fascinating interview that was done a couple of days ago on CNN featuring Annie Lowrey, who's the author of the book Give People Money. Now, Annie Lowrey is a staff writer on economics and other important affairs for The Atlantic. And in a very interesting interview, Lowrey said that this debt, this massive $1.9 trillion debt, is an inert mass that the US government and the US taxpayer has to service. Now, keep in mind that our debt has, for the first time, gone above our GDP, our gross domestic product. In short, it's a lot of debt, and it's way more than we've had in the past. It's like saying, hey, you make X amount every year, and your debt is significantly more than that. That's one way of looking at it. But Lowrey pointed out something very interesting. She said the cost of servicing the debt is much lower than ever before because, get this, because of the low interest rates that we control. That was the interesting part, because the Federal Reserve controls interest rates. I was particularly fascinated by Lowrey's use of the phrase a structural period of low interest rates, and she also said, like I said again, the debt is an inert mass that we have to service. Let's see a couple of charts on your screen from the CNN show with Annie Lowrey. Pretty fascinating stuff, and why we should have the $1.9 trillion plan, because the debt servicing cost is manageable. So what Lowrey is saying is it doesn't matter what the size of the loan is. What matters is whether you can pay off your financial obligations each month. It's like saying, hey, the size of a mortgage isn't important. What's important is whether you can service that debt, whether you can pay off that mortgage each month. Let's roll the tape and hear from Annie Lowrey, author of Give People Money, in a recent interview. Let's roll the tape.
Much money when we are already so far in the hole. Annie Lowrey explains why the answer is yes. She is a staff writer at The Atlantic. Welcome, Annie. Let me ask you sort of very simply to explain to people why, in your view, it's okay for the United States to have these kind of massive deficit and debts, where debt to GDP ratios will be up over 100% easily, probably closer to 125%.
I think the thing to think about here is how the debt is behaving in terms of its dynamics on the economy, right? The debt is this inert mass that the United States and the taxpayer needs to service, correct? And so even though the debt has gotten much bigger, we're blowing past that debt to GDP target of 100, so the debt itself is bigger than GDP measured per year, debt servicing costs have gone down because interest rates have been so low and have been so, and this was not something that many people predicted, but have been so low for so long. It feels like we're moving into, or have moved into, a structural period of low interest rates. And so the amount of debt that the United States can handle has changed a lot. And our views of how much debt and deficits are affecting the economy have changed a lot. And then I also think that we need to think about what we're spending that money on. Because if you're spending it on an investment that's going to generate more GDP down the road, something like infrastructure investment, for instance, if you're changing what the country is spending on, I think that can matter a lot too.
So you know that there are a lot of people who agree with the proposition you're making, that fundamentally interest rates are low for long, and therefore we have the opportunity to borrow and invest. But they're saying this Biden bill, and presumably the next one, is just too much.
Now, in the next segment, Fareed Zakaria, the interviewer, a pretty fascinating interview, said, he quoted Larry Summers, who used to be the U.S. Treasury Secretary and was an economic advisor to former President Barack Obama. And Larry Summers has basically said, hey, this is way more than what we need. In other words, Larry Summers was saying that, hey, the output gap, the gap between where we need to be and where we are as a direct result of the pandemic is, let's say it's close to $400 billion. This $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan is 5 times, 6 times what we need. Why do we need so much stimulus? To which Lowrey said something that was very fascinating. She said, The question is not how much we are spending, but the question is what is this spending going to do for the economy? Is this going to lead to further growth of the economy? And she said it's like war spending. That was a comment that jumped out at me. Let's roll the tape and hear from Annie Lowrey.
Says this bill, 1.9 trillion, is just way too much, and it could trigger inflation, which would then cause a rise of interest rates, which would then mean that debt servicing cost goes up. And he argues the reason, there's a very simple way to measure this, which is, it's a technical term called output gap, but basically is how much has the economy dropped off because of COVID? And there's that gap. The amount of spending planned is 4 or 5 times that gap. That does seem a little too much, no?
Certainly. I think the question is what this spending is doing in the economy. So is this sort of traditional stimulus to get us out of a traditional recession, in which case you would perhaps cause overheating, and you would see that overheating in terms of rising inflation, which the Fed would then have to raise interest rates to cool off? Or is this something different? So when you look at what's actually in the bill and what it's doing, this is billions and billions of dollars, in part to ensure vaccinations, to keep childcare centers and schools open, rental assistance to keep people from getting evicted. And then there's another portion which really is true stimulus. So the $1,400 stimulus checks, unemployment insurance payments, PPP for businesses, and some other money for small businesses. But that money isn't going to get used unless it's needed, right? You need to be unemployed in order to be applying for unemployment insurance. And so, I think that if you don't think of it, if you think of it as a kind of rescue package after a natural disaster, which in a lot of ways the coronavirus has functionally acted as, not just as a recession, but as this public health catastrophe that has taken entire sectors of the American economy functionally offline, it seems a little bit strange to be judging it only by the yardstick of it being a more traditional stimulus. In some ways it looks a lot kind of like war spending, right? We are fighting this battle. And so I'm not sure that it makes sense to think of all 1.9 trillion as just being stimulus.
And in case you've been following the news, many economists and the Republicans say that, hey, this is going to lead to inflation, this is going to lead to skyrocketing prices, it's going to lead to a weakening of the US dollar, so we shouldn't have so much money injected into the economy. To which Lowrey said, this is super important. She said, inflation is not applicable in the current environment, in the era of low interest rates. And she said, we shouldn't be cooling off the economy to solve a problem we don't have. In other words, why say, hey, let's have less stimulus, let's cool the economy because it's already running hot. By the way, this is the argument of Republicans like Rick Scott from Florida. What's up, Rick? And Rand Paul from Kentucky. What's up, Rand? Rand, I don't think likes any spending. I'm pretty sure Rand wouldn't want to spend money on a sandwich if you were hungry. So with that being said, let's take a look at Lowrey's comments again, where she says inflation not applicable with low interest rates, and we shouldn't be cooling off the economy to solve a problem we don't have, meaning inflation. Inflation is not likely to be a problem. Why worry about cooling off the economy? Let's do large stimulus. Let's roll the tape and hear the argument from this author. Let's watch.
I think the question is whether that was the lesson that applies now, and whether we could see the same circumstance given that we've moved into this era of very low interest rates. And I think it just might not be as applicable. We haven't seen problematic inflation in that way in a generation. We have no memory of it. And so given that inflation hasn't been problematic, it just seems like it might not be, we might be cooling the economy off to solve a problem that we don't have.
That was it, everyone. That was Annie Lowrey, staff writer for The Atlantic and author of the book Give People Money. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Dr. Nitin Chhoda. Please click the like button. Please subscribe. Please enable notifications. That would help me out a lot, and that would also help out the YouTube algorithm. I really appreciate you watching. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next episode of Ignition Time. By the way, you clicking the like button is a type of stimulus for me. So please go ahead and click the like button. I would really appreciate that. And again, that helps out the YouTube algorithm. Thank you so much for watching. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next episode of Ignition Time. Take care. Bye.